This is House Planning Help. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up, we've got another Encore episode, and this is where I give you the opportunity to listen to a popular episode from the archive. Today, it's my chat with architect Sarah Susanka, author of the Not So Big series of books. There are quite a few of them now as well. So why this episode? Well, because choosing the size of your house is a major decision. It has a lot of knock-on effects, whether it's the cost of the build overall, or the resources you're using, or the maintenance, or the things that go in the house. Also, people still get this wrong. Well, maybe there's an interpretation of what wrong is, but people often seem to build bigger than they actually need. And this interview is also interesting because Sarah has applied her not-so-big philosophy beyond home. So we see how could we scale down our lives as well and not just go too crazy. Before we get into the interview, a quick resource to share. I often like to do this, or something interesting that's going on. But I've been reading George's blog. This is a self-build blog of Old Holloway passive house that's being built at the moment. And I have to say, it's very good. I've been meaning to mention it on the podcast for a while, but haven't actually got round to it. So George is actually an architect, and it's always interesting to see what architects build. But I think he's been quite thrifty here as well. He's one of the archetype crew too. So that means he's embracing simplicity a lot in what he's doing, and just lovely materials. Plus, the other thing is he's a really good photographer, and so that means there are a lot of beautiful images as he works his way through. It's a straw bale panel system that they're using called Encore. We've featured that before in a podcast. Also, the cladding is charred cedar. There's a tin roof. It's, I think, on one level. I could be wrong, but it looks like it's on one level. So you can just see the entire process that they have gone through. I'll put that link into today's show notes so you can refer back to that. If you are someone who enjoys a good self-build blog, this is definitely another one. Let's get to our Encore episode with Sarah Susanka, author of The Not So Big House and many other books, also titled Not So Big... We're discussing how big your home needs to be today. It's an open-ended question. However, I think there are some times when perhaps we go completely overboard. So that's why this is a good discussion to come back to. Let's get into the interview. I started by asking Sarah to tell me a little bit about her background.
Well, I actually grew up in England. I lived in Kent in just a little village called Knockholt, not far from Sevenoaks or Bromley for people who know the area. And I was a daughter of an inventor who got a job with Mattel Toy Company in Los Angeles. And so at the age of 14 in 1971, my whole family moved to Los Angeles. And it was quite an amazing journey in a way, because I lived in this little village with 1,000 people in it, and I moved to an area of American sprawl. And my high school was 3 times the size of my village, so it was just incredible. I didn't know there were that many adolescents in the world, let alone at one school. But one of the things that really struck me as soon as I arrived in this suburban quote unquote paradise was that there was no place to walk to. You could walk around houses, suburban settings, but there were no shops. So to get to the shops, we had to walk for probably about 2.5 miles. And my mother was terrified initially of driving on American roads with her huge car that my dad had bought her. So we felt very isolated. It was quite an unusual experience. And of course, I got used to it, and I've lived here for the rest of my life. But I have this interesting perspective on the American house and the American development habits, if you like, that would make me a commentator on how to do it differently. And my English upbringing has had a huge influence on what I talk about. I'm now an architect and an author, and I try to help people see how to build smaller but better houses.
So when did this first develop? Was it really just coming across from England and then you thought, right, I'm going to sit down and work out some plans, or how did it move on?
Well, actually, it was an outgrowth of an interest I had as a young child. I loved drawing floor plans, even when I was in England. And when I got to this country, that just continued. But I really didn't know what an architect was until I got to college and realized that was what I wanted to be. So the interest grew. I certainly was motivated to do something at the age of 14. I thought there is something huge missing here, and I can see what it is, and I want to talk about it. But it wasn't until I'd been in architecture school and come out the other side of it that I realized, I was perhaps perfectly trained both from my childhood and then from my architectural studies to be able to help people design better houses here.
So, how has it impacted on your designs then? What are we talking about here?
Well, the things that I describe, I suspect a lot of your listeners will be familiar with the American McMansion phenomenon. But here, people build bigger and bigger and bigger houses, thinking that somehow that's going to get them the sense of home that they're looking for. And the very simple observation I make is that the feeling of home has nothing to do with size. It's a quality and not a quantity. And having grown up in England, and my friends had some wonderful houses, many of them with lots of interesting nooks and crannies and a sense of history about them. A lot of American homes are devoid of those things that really make them feel like home. And so I started to try to describe what makes a house feel like home. A lot of what I talk about actually has to do with shaping the whole space, not just the floor plan. And I think in England, because we're surrounded by history, we have a sense of what, for example, a thick wall and being able to sit in a little window seat within that thick wall gives you an incredible experience. In this country, we don't have that. We've got 2x6 or 2x4 walls that make it feel very paper thin. And so I try to give people a sense of what it means to shape the whole space.
I must admit that I don't know a lot about the housing stock in America, so this might be a good point. Maybe you could give us an overview.
Absolutely. Well, when I wrote The Not So Big House, which was the first in my book series, that came out in 1998. And the houses were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And what I knew from working with my architectural clients was that what people were really wanting was a well-designed house, but they didn't know how to ask for it. They didn't have a sense of what energy efficiency was. And so I was just doing that automatically and making every house that I designed energy efficient, well insulated, with an eye to good indoor air quality, many of the things that I'm sure you cover in your program. But the American public at that time wasn't really thinking about that. And so I even actually described what sustainability means in that first book because it wasn't really the buzzword that it's become since that time.
Do we all have a different meaning for sustainability?
I would say that's fairly likely.
I just thought I'd interject there.
Oftentimes I feel as though people have used the term so much that it's lost some meaning, but it's actually a very valuable term in understanding that whatever we do, it needs to look after you, the family, the community, the neighborhood, and the planet as a whole. Every decision you're making is made not just on a self-serving basis, but looking at the whole picture, understanding that you're part of one whole organism in a way. And I think a lot of the people that are attracted to my books and the attitude about house design are very interested in sustainability, or some will call it green design or energy efficient design. But the goal is to create a place that is going to last for a very long time and is going to support you in the best means that you can while using the minimum amount of resources to heat and cool that place and to decorate it, etc. There's one key idea, Ben, that you may be interested in, and that is I really believe that beauty has to be at the core of any really sustainable home. Because if something isn't beautiful, we don't tend to look after it. I don't know in England what the parallel is, but in this country, about 100 years ago, there were a whole uh, group of bungalows that were built, very lovely, simple designs based on the work of William Morris and Gustav Stickley. And they really embody a sense of beauty that's very simple. But people have looked after those houses so that today the value of those homes far surpasses what you would imagine for a house of that scale. And they are really well cared for. So we, as human beings, are a very important part of keeping something sustainable, and we respond to beauty. So I think that's a real key.
It's such a balance, isn't it? All of these
Mhm.
different components that you've got to get together, that I can see why it's so difficult to design the perfect house, because it changes where you are, it
Yep.
changes who you are. All of these different factors come together, and as we try to move to a more sustainable and energy efficient future, then that is leading the way. But I know what you're saying. I think that does make a lot of sense, to create something that you're proud of, that you want to look after. Makes sense to
That's
me.
right. That's right. Exactly. In fact, much of what I'm speaking about in a way is a revisiting of the arts and crafts movement, but not particularly with that style of architecture, but more the sensibility, the attitude that sometimes less can be more, and that the qualities of home are really what make us feel inspired. So, in many ways, although you can get very complex in the world of energy efficiency, I like to keep it as simple as I can, because I think oftentimes when something appears very complex, people don't do it because they're afraid they're going to not do it right. And it doesn't have to be that complicated. Obviously, at the root of my message is, why don't you just build the square footage that you need rather than all kinds of spaces that get used very rarely? Where you have, for example, in this country, people build formal living rooms and dining rooms that nobody ever uses. I mean, that's crazy. And so I encourage people to instead build informal spaces that they use every day, and understand that when your friends come over, with just a little bit of changing of the lighting, you can make it into a delightful room that's going to be very gracious for your guests, but they actually want to be where you are. They're not interested in having their socks blown off. They just want to be in a comfortable place.
How much space then is too much space, or does it depend on the individual who's building the house?
I believe that it depends on the individual. I've tried very hard to stay away from judging people for having too much space. What might be too much to me may be just right to somebody else. So I leave it to the individual to make those decisions. But what I try to do is give people the tools to make those decisions in a way that really benefits their lifestyle, that allows them to make those choices. So I have in my fan club people who ascribe to very, very tiny houses at one end of the spectrum, and people who at the other end might think that 3,000 square feet was a small house, so it's, it's really a very wide range. And I just let them make their own choices on that matter.
Are you always thinking about open planned spaces, or when you create a room, I was watching some of your videos earlier, that you have more than one purpose for those rooms?
Um, I I tend to do double duty with the rooms that I design. So, for example, we just talked about the living area that can serve both formal and informal functions, or a dining area that is your everyday space, but then also can be a formal space on those occasions that you need it. But I tend to take that attitude with a lot of other rooms as well. For example, in many American houses, there is a guest bedroom or even a guest bedroom suite that sits empty 99% of the time, if not 100% of the time, often filled with boxes and things because nobody's using the room. So I encourage people to think of that room, for example, as perhaps an in home office, that on those few occasions that you do have somebody stay, you can hide the office function a little bit so that that room can do double duty. So it's, in a way, a very practical way of thinking, but I'm just trying to help people to see how they can use every square foot of their house every day.
I noticed when I was reading a little bit about you that the book A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander came up. Now, I've heard this mentioned before, but is that a very influential book to all architects, and why, for people that haven't read it?
It is a very influential book, and the reason is that it's something that I think a lot of people they don't realize that they have inside them an understanding of building and architecture. What a pattern language did was allowed people to really grasp that they can choose how they want their environment to be using principles that are very simple to apply. So, for example, Christopher Alexander talks about one pattern is what he would call alcoves. And it simply says that human beings like to hang out in smaller spaces looking into a larger room. So that alcove becomes, in a way, an archetype for designing and building. When people who are not trained in design look through this book, it tends to make them feel as though they now have a set of tools by which to think about space. So I actually was introduced to this book when I was in college, but I realized it was still written in a way that made it difficult for homeowners to really absorb and then apply. And so my fourth book, Home by Design, which I actually dedicated to Christopher Alexander, takes a lot of the principles that I've used in my own work and that I see in architects' work in residential architecture and help explain with pictures that people are more familiar with, photographs of houses that are from the present day, and help them to see how they can apply these ideas in their own homes.
So, where are you going with your work now? What is your focus on as each day goes by?
Well, I am doing a lot of public speaking these days, and I'm starting also to talk about community design as well as individual house design. Actually, some of your listeners may know that I've also written a book called The Not So Big Life, where I'm really trying to help people to see how, just as we have more space than we need, at least in this country, I know it's not always true in England, um, we also fill our lives with too much activity so that we don't have time to really enjoy what's right here in front of us. And these attitudes are all really interwoven. So the understanding that we can slow down a little bit and really enjoy our lives in the moment as opposed to be rushing around trying to keep up with all of the emails and all of the things that we have to do, our lives can get completely out of control, just as our houses can get completely out of control. And for me, the community, which in England is I actually just visited last summer, and there's such a wonderful sense of community in so many of the towns and villages in England that are largely absent in this country. And so I've been trying to help bring that sense of a heart to the community so that people can have more of a sense of integration in their lives, really.
Why is that? Why is it missing? I don't really understand why there should be a difference.
I think the big difference is that a lot of this country was developed after the advent of the automobile. And so even though obviously there were settlements around the country before the automobile really took hold, the freeway system and the interstate system in this country have made everything spread out. So you don't need to walk anywhere. In fact, it's very difficult to walk some places. You have to get in your car to go. And so when you move past people in a car, you don't get to talk to them, you don't get to stop and say, "How are you doing?" And just those everyday interconnections that are so vital to our feeling connected to one another, they don't happen. And a lot of people in this country don't even realize it's missing because they've never lived in a place that has that. But those of us who've grown up in another country often realize there's a big something missing, and we would love to get that brought into the community. So just introducing the idea that you can walk places, you don't have to go in your car for 2 blocks. You can
But
actually
this is
just
difficult, as you say, because it's developed around the car. That must pose some huge problems as
it does.
fuel, or gas, as you guys like to call it, gets more and more expensive. You can't just walk around the town. So is that in anyone's vision of we're going to change things?
Just barely. It's mostly I mean, there are certainly some groups of people, most notably a group called the New Urbanists that you may have heard of, who are really trying to learn from both European towns and villages and some of the older communities in this country, and just to get the proportioning, for example, of a street width correct, so that you feel like you've got some connection to the other side of the street as you're walking down one side or the other. Really basic things that are just not normal to development in this country. So it's going to be a real learning process, and in some ways an uphill battle because it's changing people's behavior dramatically. Everything relates to the car here.
How do you see the vision of the next 10 or 20 years? What's your view of the changes that are coming? Because I feel that there are going to be some big changes and they could actually happen quite quickly. We're noticing them and we have been living through them for the past 20 years, but I wonder whether it might accelerate.
I think it will. I think actually, if you look at anything, not just house design or urban planning, but many, many different parts of our culture, because we're now able to talk to each other so easily. Here are you and I speaking across thousands of miles very simply and sharing ideas and being able to then disperse these ideas on the internet, etc., that we're able to connect our thoughts around the world. I often call this our infant global brain is coming online.
Yep.
And
Yeah,
so,
yeah, I'm with you 100% on this.
yes.
And I think this could be quite powerful just at the right time, luckily.
Exactly. And I personally feel that although we've been through hard economic times in this country, I think they've been very valuable because they have woken people up to the recognition that they don't need as much stuff and as much space as they thought they needed. A lot of people got a big wake-up call and realized we want something that looks nice and that feels nice to live in, but we don't need masses and masses and masses of space, which is really a new idea for a large segment of the population in this country. So I think it's really changing for the better. I think that we've got a huge opportunity to design a better environment all round. And I think people are ready and receptive. So although, as I say, in this country at least, a fair amount of reconditioning in order to get people used to that notion, I think there's a lot of interest. And if you look at, for example, generationally, the millennials and the boomers are both really interested in downsizing and in living closer to the town center or a place where it's very walkable. So I think there's a lot of very good signs.
I have a friend who I used to work with and he moved away. And it was only recently that I realised I haven't actually seen you for about a year and a half because we're always talking over the internet or I can see his face on Skype. So
Right.
it's quite funny like that. And I do wonder that working remotely might become far more acceptable. There is outsourcing that happens day by day, but that could be another way of actually saving a lot of energy by working at your desk. You'd be working at a desk if you had to drive on the commute an hour each way or however far it is.
Right. Well, certainly in my world, that's already happening. I work now with architects in several different states, and we don't need one place to all be meeting. We can share our desktops when we're working on a project together. It's actually easier in some ways than leaning over somebody's shoulder. So it's happening. And when I design a house, I try to make sure that it's got workspace in it that can be the in-home office that will allow people to work virtually. So I think it's well on its way to happening, and I think it will find each other working not just from county to county in England or state to state in this country, but from country to country very frequently.
Well, it's been fascinating to chat with you, Sarah, so thank you very much for your time. Maybe you want to advise us, where's the best place to come and find out more information about you?
Well, if you go to notsobighouse.com, you'll be able to learn a lot more about the Not So Big House concepts. And there's actually 9 books in the series. And so I've got quite a few things for you to read. I know I have an English following, and those of you who are English will recognize where a lot of these ideas came from. And then also, if you're interested in the Not So Big Life part, if you go to notsobiglife.com, that's got lots of other resources. And finally, I'm on Facebook, so communicate with people from all over the world on Facebook. So that's just, I have a Sarah Susanka fan page.
Superb. Well, is there a final thought that you want to finish on?
Well, I would just like to say that the way to make your house really feel as though it fits you is to start by looking at what is it that I like. Oftentimes people are really scared out of making their house their own because they've told they can't do that because they won't be able to sell it later. And I think that's a very poor idea for not making your house your own. So hang up those pictures that you've got sitting in the cupboard and really make it personal, because that's what will make you fall in love with your house.
Sarah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session. You'll find them at houseplanninghelp.com/Sarah. You can review the key points. Also, we'll link you across to where you can find Sarah's many, many books. And Sarah is on Twitter too, so we'll link her up at houseplanninghelp.com/Sarah with an H at the end. Let's finish, as we often do, with a hub update. And the reason that I set this up, well, a couple of reasons actually. The first one being that I think as you're going through this, there'll be times that you've got challenges and they can be tricky to overcome, but it can feel like you're doing this for the first time. You're the first person who's ever built a house. And the fact of the matter is, it's quite difficult to meet other people who are doing the same thing as you. It might even be just down the road from you, but it's tricky to know who those people are and how you might bump into them. So that is definitely a big aspect of the hub. There's the community side. We've got the private forum where you can just have a chat and ask questions and see where people are in their projects. And then we get on a conference call, the progress calls that we're doing every quarter, looking to up that to once a month in 2017. Also, there's the learning side, because clearly if you're interacting with other people, you're going to learn things or understand why they're making certain decisions. And we produce a lot of video at Regen Media, so we have that ability. It's just that video can be expensive to create, but it's a really good way of getting the message across if you can invest in video. So that's why I thought membership website, really good way of almost funding the video content and being able to do some cool stuff, which is why we've got 2 in-depth case studies. First it was Long Barrow, and now we're on to Buckinghamshire Passive House, where we just go in-depth, step by step, really interested in the decisions that are being made on site. And then the final thing is the learning modules, where we try to lay a trail step by step. How can we simplify this? We're not 100% there yet, but we will be constantly refining this to make it as simple as possible. So don't take it from me, all this value. What about read some testimonials of people who are Hub members? You can do that at houseplanninghelp.com/join. This is your last opportunity to get in at the current price as well, because from 10 p.m. UK time on November the 25th, which is also Black Friday, the price will no longer be available. So we'll also be closing the doors. The reason for that is we want to try and focus on the existing intake and serve them as best we can. And I think that will be the best way to do that. So we'll open the doors again at some point in 2017. So once again, your last chance to take advantage this year, houseplanninghelp.com/join. That's it. Thanks for listening. Next time we have our final Encore episode. What's been our most downloaded podcast? Well, I can tell you the topic. It's air tightness, but I'm not going to tell you who the interview is with. You'll have to wait till the next session. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.